Alright, let's talk about some punk rock. Those of you that have had Fregosa because you're a CP kiddo and you've had her for PPS, probably already had at least some exposure to this. But the reason why I'm talking about punk rock is that punk rock actually plays a kind of prominent role in Persepolis. She gets pretty into punk music and the punk culture, and it definitely kind of becomes an aspect of kind of what she's about overall as a person as she's growing up in this situation. And a lot of the ethos of punk rock music is found. Here's an image from the film. A lot of the ethos of punk rock music is found in the story of Persepolis as well. So, however, I also understand that most of you probably do not come from households where your parents listen to a lot of punk rock, and it's a distinctly Western musical form. So I figured that going through a brief history of punk rock and the punk ethos and the punk movement might be helpful to understand the kind of role that it's playing in our novel, especially because it's going to have a little bit to do with one of the projects that we do at the end of this as well. So let's go through this really quick. The whole idea of doing a punk rock introduction in class is hilarious in and of itself because it's kind of antithetical to what punk rock stood for. But let's start with punk music. Punk music is fast, loud, raw, energetic, and it basically doesn't follow the standard conventions of what songs or music are supposed to be. There's oftentimes not really a chorus. The music is very, very simple. It's really based around shows and performing live. While punk bands do put out albums and they do record music, the general idea behind the music is built around the live performances. And the lyrics are usually meaningful, usually political or socially relative, but are often hard to decipher because they're screamed or shouted or yelled. It is purposely unpretty music. It is music that is not meant to be pleasant. It is meant to be loud and aggressive, but not necessarily pleasant or melodic. So there are some subgenres to punk. We're not going to get too in-depth into this, but just know that there are different levels to punk. You got punk up here, and it's kind of the umbrella term for some of these other genres. So, for instance, you got hardcore, and then inside of hardcore, you've got a couple of other smaller subgenres. Hardcore bands were bands that were extremely fast. Lyrics are really shouted, really loud. And that's like Black Flag and Bad Brains. And then you've got Oi punk, which is out of England mostly, and it was a reaction to this idea in America that punk rockers were rich white kids from New York that didn't need to even have real jobs because their parents had money and stuff. And so Oi punk is really about the working man, again, especially in like England, from the industrial towns. And it was a scene that grew out of that. And then the straight edge scene, really headed up by a guy named Ian MacKaye, who was in Fugazi and in Minor Threat, and then in another band that was post-punk called the Rites of Spring, is really a counterculture to the culture. So a big part of the punk culture was excess and a lot of drinking and a lot of drugs and a lot of excess. And the straight edge scene is the opposite of that. It is an extension of the teetotalers. Hold on. Teetotalers, which is the straight edge scene is about Well, it's about not drinking and not doing drugs. They abstain from alcohol. They abstain from drugs. They usually abstain from any kind of cigarettes. Anytime that you meet somebody that is a straight edger, they will probably have big X's tattooed on them somewhere because they are identifying themselves as part of the straight edge movement. And so it was the counterculture to the counterculture movement of punk. And then you've got thrash, speedcore, which is really influenced by like heavy metal. These are bands like Anthrax, where the music is just really, really fast. And then you've got art and noise punk, which is, I mean, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's just noise music, and it's really a deconstruction of kind of what makes a song and what makes music. And then you've got ska, and I could do a whole another unit on ska because I was a ska kid back in the 90s. But basically, ska is an African and Jamaican musical form that was then appropriated by a bunch of punk people into second and third wave ska, which is a punk music that is really built around a kind of backbeat African driven sound. All right, so let's talk about the United States punk movement. All right, and I'm going to make myself real small here because I got a lot of pictures coming up. So the U.S. punk movement started it was really more of a scene than a movement. It really started in New York, very small, in the South Side of New York, and really in two clubs. So in the 70s, in the late 60s, early 70s, you had a lot of these groups that are called proto-punk groups. They were groups that were building up the punk sound, but were not really full-on punk bands yet. And they started the kind of punk movement, but nobody really paid attention to it in America. But then we sent it overseas to the United Kingdom. The Clash and the Sex Pistols, well, band members of groups that would become the Clash and the Sex Pistols, saw a group called the Ramones play, and they became inspired to go back and start their own bands in the United Kingdom, and it really took off, and they became quite important bands over there. And then that led to an explosion of the punk scene in America. It officially kind of starts in 1995 in London, but developed in the late 60s, early 70s in America. So one way to think of it is that we created punk, shipped it off to the U.S., and then they sold it back to us. So there are two major places where punk kind of got started. One of the first, before punk as a genre really exists, is a place called Max's Kansas City, which is a nightclub in New York. Not in Kansas, it is in New York. And Max's Kansas City it's on the south side of Manhattan, and it was really a gathering place for a lot of artists and musicians from all kinds of different art mediums in the 60s into the early 80s. And one cat that hung out there a lot was Andy Warhol, and he had this whole entourage that kind of traveled with him. Andy Warhol was a pop artist in the 50s and 60s and was probably, at the time that he was alive, probably the most famous artist in the world. And he brought in this band called the Velvet Underground, which were probably one of the most influential rock bands, probably the last 50 years, if you talk about people that inspired other people. The New York Dolls, Bruce Springsteen, Bob Marley, Iggy Pop, and the Stooges, Madonna, they all came and they all played at Max's Kansas City. And Blondie, who would go on to be a lead singer for her own punk band called Blondie, was a waitress there. And Lou Reed wrote a song called A Walk on the Wild Side, which was about the back room downstairs. All right, this is a picture of that nightclub, probably late 60s, early into the 70s, maybe like 72, 73. And then there's another place on the south side of Manhattan called CBGB's, which in the 60s was a dive bar that a bunch of Hell's Angels hung out at, and then ended up becoming a major part of the punk rock and then other genres of music development in the New York scene. Became probably one of the most recognizable music venues in the world. Just if you grew up during the 70s, 80s, or 90s, you knew what the inside of CBGB's looked like, even if you had never been there, just because it was just that recognizable of a venue. This is what the inside of it looked like. You can tell, I mean, it was a very small space. It was not big. Which is funny because, like, some of the most important bands in the history of American music played in this little venue, in this little dive hole. This is what the bathroom looked like. It's appropriately horrific. This is the Ramones playing CBGB's in the early 70s. Alright, and that brings us to the Ramones. So if you had to pick one group that you could probably say was maybe the first defining punk band, it might be the Ramones. The Ramones came out with their first album, and it is kind of the manifesto of what punk music was. The longest song on the album was 2.5 minutes long. Everything is super duper short, super simple, 3 chords. The lyrics are not really sung so much as shouted. It's very fast, very, very upbeat, and it just kind of moves. Other major U.S. bands that you should maybe know, kind of go through these kind of quickly. And then over here I've got kind of prominent lyrics from these artists and kind of, that kind of catch the ethos of who they are. You've got Minor Threat. This is that guy Ian MacKaye, who started the whole straight edge movement as well. Minor Threat was a punk band in DC in the early 80s, and they were really, really important, informative for the hardcore punk sound. Then you've got the New York Dolls, who were a proto-punk band in the late 60s, early 70s, and the New York Dolls, while they were really influential to punk music, they were also really influential into glam rock as well. They kind of skirted the line between them. They were a really, really interesting group. They kind of did a lot of different things that were really influential for a lot of different reasons. Then you've got Iggy Pop and the Stooges. When you think about what a rock star is kind of in our modern age, and like what a frontman is, really what you're thinking about is you're thinking about Iggy Pop and the Stooges, Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones, and the Who. And that's kind of where all of our ideas about what it means to be a kind of rock singer come from. And then you've got Patti Smith, who, Patti Smith was really, really interesting. She was all about the punk rock ethos and the punk rock ideas, but she did it more from a singer-songwriter perspective than from a loud, really fast tempo kind of thing. So she had, and she played and performed with a bunch of these punk rock groups. She actually played the very last concert ever performed at CBGB's after they lost their lease in 2016. But she was definitely, just a really interesting artist. And then you've got Bad Brains, which were a Jamaican/DC outfit who were really big into the hardcore punk scene as well. But then conversely, while punk is developing in America, it is equally developing, and just as, if not more important, over in the UK. And you can say that while the punk scene started in America, the movement, the ethos, the kind of ideas that become attached to punk rock start in the 70s over in the United Kingdom. And a lot of that is because in the 1970s, and this is true in Britain and in America, a lot of the punk ethos comes because there were these recessions in both America and in like England. A lot of people were angry, they were unemployed, wages sucked, inflation was skyrocketing, and working class adolescents and working class people just didn't have an outlet, and they had all these ideas and this pent-up frustration, and punk really kind of came in and satisfied that. And so one of the ways to kind of think about it, especially from the like England side of things, is that, you know, the jobless were hopeless, and that led to them being angry, and that led to them turning to the punk movement, which was really about a wholesale rejection of the status quo, because the status quo wasn't working for people. So the group that opened up our video today was the Sex Pistols, and they were probably the most important punk group to come out of the UK, certainly. Some would argue the most important punk group, period. biggest song is probably Anarchy in the UK. Yeah, I mean, but they were just about being angry and being disruptive and just wanting something new, and really just kind of anti any kind of establishment. And that's really, I mean, this is where we get into kind of the idea that punk is more than just music, and this is where the overlap with Persepolis comes in. Punk is really a philosophy based on this kind of anarchist political views on the idea of like liberation and just kind of getting rid of the systems of power that were in place because they just weren't working for most people, and finding something new. And even if that something was nothingness, this movement decided that nothingness was better than what existed. And so a lot of punks believe that the only way to achieve true individual freedom was just by abolishing all establishments, governments, corporations, any sort of like conformity or expected ways of living or thinking, and they thought that we just kind of maybe needed to throw all of it out of the window and maybe start over, because what they had seen is that there had just been these successive failures and that things just were never getting better. And I think that as you read Persepolis, there's a lot of this kind of punk philosophy that is kind of built into the novel as a whole, which is why music and the identification with like punk music becomes an important motif in the work as a whole, is that those same successive failures that were present in the Western world are what she is experiencing as she grows up in Iran. So what that means is that punk music, the lyrics are frequently oppositional. They are anti-romantic gestures. They are anti-government, anti-parents, anti-peer groups, anti-conformity. They're just kind of against lots of things. And hear me out. That's not to say that punk rock has done a great job at offering solutions to these things, but they've definitely done a great job of making us think about the ways that things are not working. And so from this kind of ethos that the music started, a bunch of punk zines, which are short for magazines, but non-commercial magazines put out by just independent writers, independently, a big emphasis on do-it-yourself that talked about everything from politics and society to how to build your own house, how to grow your own food, because the emphasis here was on how to get past these systems that had been in place. And one of the best ways to do that is to not need them anymore. And here's some of the classic punk iconography here. This A in the circle, you've probably seen it before. It's the symbol for anarchy, and anarchy is really just the absence of any kind of governmental regulation. And so this movement in the UK is what builds this punk ethos, which would then later become adopted by the punk movement as a whole whenever it comes back to America. So we started punk music, but it becomes a movement with this ethos attached whenever it moves over to the United Kingdom, and then they sell it back to us. This is one of the punk clubs, the Roxy in London. So other notable punk artists from the UK, The Clash. If there's one punk band that you've probably heard, it is probably The Clash. They are probably just the most radio friendly of all of the punk bands as well. The Adolescents, and then the Damned, and then the Buzzcocks. And the Buzzcocks were kind of part of that oi punk movement. So, punk ethos. Let's talk a little bit more about this punk ethos and this punk aesthetic. And I'm trying to go, I know I'm blowing through a lot of this here, but I'm trying to go quickly so that way you can, so that way you're not here for an hour. Alright, so one, the punk ethos is angry. And the idea is that fighting is better than not caring. That it's better to be angry, that it's better to resist and stand up and sacrifice than it is to be apathetic. And so a lot of these guys suffer from the Napoleon complex. They are young, they're poor and they're powerless, and so they feel like they have something to prove. All right. And then that leads us to the idea of the working class style and then attitude. So, well, not all people from the punk rock movement were of a low socioeconomic background. They typically got behind the idea that that any kind of classism or elitism was antithetical to what the punk movement was about, because the punk movement was about the support of the working class and of the more disenfranchised in society. And so punk often takes a very progressive or anarchist, liberal perspective on society and politics. Punk is all about being honest and being authentic. It's anti-hypocrisy, it's anti-BS, it's anti-escapism. It is all about just kind of looking around the world, being honest about it, and not sugarcoating things. You know, if you think something sucks, you just say, I think this sucks. If you think a person sucks, you tell them, I think you suck. It's about being who you are authentically all the time, regardless of if that makes people uncomfortable or not. And in many ways, this is where I think your guys' generation and the punk movement maybe have the most in common, is that if there's one thing that your generation really appreciates, it is authenticity. It's people being who they are and being honest and being genuine. You guys typically don't suffer people to be projections or facades of themselves. And then also the punk movement was very, very skeptical. It was skeptical of authority. It was skeptical of traditional ideas of romance. It was skeptical of businesses. It was skeptical of schools and mass media and promises and the future. And the idea here is because all of those things have been, from the punk's perspective, habitually screwing people over for generations. So why shouldn't they be skeptical of it? Where was the proof in the pudding? The authority has never worked out. Romances and the divorce rate was skyrocketing. Businesses were only interested in themselves and in profit, not in the workers. You know, school had not led to a better life, and had been about teaching conformity of behavior just as much as it had been about information. And so the punk movement is very skeptical of all of these things because they see it all as systems of oppression. And hopefully you're starting to kind of see how the punk movement in Persepolis are dealing a lot with these things, and how those things also relate to things in our current world, like the Black Lives Matter movement. Which, if you're paying attention to a lot of ethos here, a lot of the ethos here is what you'll see in our uprisings today, and in our kind of people that are trying to create their own revolutions against systems of oppression. The people involved in the movements might look different, and the movements might look different, but the ethos is very similar here. The punks were very, very socially critical. They were very politically aware. They were pro-outlaw. They were anarchist. They were anti-military. They were also, for the most part, hugely anti-racist, hugely anti-homophobia. You can go back and find videos from the 60s of punk people calling out homophobia and racism from the stage of their shows. If we're being fair and honest, there was a small branch of the punk movement in the 80s and the early 90s in Europe predominantly that broke off and ended up courting some neo-Nazi elements, and what that led to were these giant punk fights where the anti-racist, anti-bigot, anti-fascist punks would end up getting in these big brawls with these kind of neo-Nazi skinhead punks, which is a whole other thing that I don't really have time to get into because I told you I wasn't going to try that long. So these guys are also big into being individualists. They want to express their feelings that polite society would censor out, which is really the heart of the punk movement, right? We want to speak the truth. The punk ethos is all you need is 3 chords and the truth, right? Just we are going to speak truth to power. We're going to talk about society as we see it. We're going to live the way that we want to live, whether or not it makes you uncomfortable, and that's what they were all about. Um, and so that leads to them being anti-heroic and like anti-rock star, right? And here's a quote: "We are contemptuous of a majority manipulated by the mass media, unthinking, unaware, sleepwalking through life, conformist, fashion-controlled sheep who are being led to a subtle economic slavery and martial slaughter." And so a lot of this too is a reaction. So real quick history lesson. So you had these hippies that happened in the late 60s, early 70s. And in the 80s, what you see a lot of these hippies hang up their free love and peace and marching and protesting hats and become corporate business people. And when the hippies hang all of that stuff up, they end up pushing for conformity more than any other generation ever, probably. There was the way to dress. There was the business suit. There was I mean, the 80s were just a time of just extreme conformity and mall rats and this idea that there was a right way to look and a right way to sound and so on and so forth. And the punk movement really stood as a stark rejection of all of that. So the Sex Pistols were really important because they turned punk from a small scene into an international movement. And they led the way for a lot of other punk bands getting attention. But they had to do this by signing record deals with major recording companies. And this leads ultimately to the paradox of punk, which is that you can't be mainstream and also against the mainstream. But in order to be heard, you have to have an audience. And how do you have an audience unless you kind of blow up at least a little bit? And this therein becomes the paradox of punk. Punk inevitably wants to kill itself because punk inevitably doesn't want to go mainstream, doesn't want to be successful, and the only way to be anti-rockstar and anti-consumerism and anti-commercialism and anti-big business is to stay small. But to stay small means that nobody can ever make can ever make a living being in a punk band, and so punk just inevitably kind of commits suicide. In 1977, the Sex Pistols break up. Sid Vicious ends up dying, who was their lead singer. And in a lot of ways, that was kind of the end of the punk movement of the 70s. We see another punk movement happen in the 80s, and then it kind of gets eaten by this genre of music called New Wave, which is where a bunch of really radio-friendly people like Billy Idol, who wrote "It's a Nice Day for a White Wedding," take the punk aesthetic and the punk style, and they kind of then steal it, and they make a bunch of radio-friendly music, and that was really the kind of death of punk. But let's talk a little bit about punk fashion. Punk fashion was all about being the opposite of what you were supposed to be. So if you were supposed to have nice, neatly cut hair that wasn't too long, then punks were going to have long hair and style it in a way that was all over the place. And if you were supposed to have clothes that were tailored and fit nice, then punks were going to have clothes that were too short or too tight or too big, and they were going to have holes in them. And and so the idea is that they were just trying to be anti-fashion. There were no rules to punk fashion. There was no one look that was the punk look. There was a bunch, like you can see here, right? Like these are prominent punk artists, but they don't look anything like these guys who are the Sex Pistols. But that's fine, because the idea is that it was just an anti-fashion statement. It was dressing the way that society thought that you shouldn't dress. Eventually, though, we do get kind of a push for a more homogenous punk style, which ends up being leather jackets torn and ripped clothing that didn't match, lots of stockings, and combat boots, and safety pins and communist symbols, and just kind of anything that was meant to be shocking and upsetting to the general populace was kind of what these guys were like all about. They wore their hair in the most shocking way possible. They wore clothes that were supposed to shock, because they're, again, the entire idea is to be the opposite of what society says you are supposed to be. And then let's talk about punk art. So there's a whole genre of art built around punk posters, and the kind of punk ethos behind making these posters. So in the punk movement, there's this big push for this idea of the do-it-yourself movement and making your own things and not having to buy things and not falling into this consumerist trap. And so the artists would oftentimes make their own posters, draw their own art, so on and then so forth, and they would look like this, right? So like you can see where like a lot of this is, you know, taking and cutting pictures out and combining them together. These are pictures of Ronald Reagan, who was president, the governor of California, like at the time, and then eventually became president. But then they've superimposed a bunch of other pictures. They've cut out snippets of other magazines to piece letters together, right? And this kind of becomes the punk aesthetic, the way that they kind of make punk posters and then punk art. Probably one of the most iconic images is this God Save the Queen image from the Sex Pistols. But this is the punk art aesthetic, and this punk art aesthetic has been appropriated now by a bunch of other people in a bunch of other ways that have kind of ripped off this look that came from these punk posters. But the idea was just, make it yourself and make it mean something. You don't see any of these images here that aren't communicating some idea, but besides just the fact that these punk bands are in play, right? They're all heavily communicating ideas about politics and society and the punk ethos, and then what punk music is supposed to be about, because again, that punk ethos is embedded in kind of everything that these guys do. So I'm also going to link up. I'm going to put this PowerPoint up so that way you can see it, and that way you can click through it. So this week for your discussion post, all right, your discussion post this week is going to be, I've got some songs here, all right, and I want you to tell me if they're punk or not, all right, based on what you know about punk, the music, the ethos, the way that it was structured, and I just want you to tell me which of these songs you think are punk, which of them are not punk, and kind of why you think that they're punk. And then, then that'll be your discussion post for this week. And then maybe we can get some responses going where hopefully you guys have some disagreements about some things that you think are or are not punk. So that'll be it. All right, as always, if you guys need anything, let me know. And this week, don't forget, you've got some more Persepolis questions to answer, just like last week. I also have the vocab up. And then that'll be it. Have a good one, guys.
Scars, try to control. Rock the boat, we're gonna rock the boat. They distort what we say. Rock the boat, we're gonna rock the boat. Can't stop what we do. Rock the boat, we're gonna rock the boat. When they can't do the sound. Rock the boat, we're gonna rock the boat. Wait, I'm tired of your abuse. Try to stop us. It's no use. Society's under control. Rock the boat, we're gonna rock the boat. Think that's my taking themselves. Rock the world, we're gonna rock the world. Rock the world behind our back. Rock the world, we're gonna rock the world. Rock the world, rock the world, rock the world. We tired of your fucking shit. Try to stop us. No use. Go. It's no use. We are born with a chance. Rock the world, we're gonna rock the world. We're gonna have our chance. Rock the world, we're gonna rock the world. We are born. Yeah. Rock the world, rock the world. We're gonna have our chance. Rock the world, rock the world. We are tired of your abuse. Try to stop us. It's no use.